Hey everyone, it is Thursday night, Sober Nation tradition. As you guys may already know, we go live every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Tonight we're starting later, 9:30 Eastern, where we usually talk about topics that are important to our community at large. And so tonight, we thought we'd talk about what happens when AA doesn't work. And now we know that there are people who don't, who just don't like AA or just don't feel like they connect or had a negative experience. And we want everybody to know, like, if that's where you're at, there's nothing wrong with you. And I'm so excited because I'm joined by a dear friend of mine. Her name is Olivia Penelle, and she is an amazing writer, and she writes for publications like The Fix and other recovery websites, and she's just super smart and recently wrote an article with that same title, There is Nothing Wrong with You If AA Doesn't Work. So what better person to discuss this with than my friend Liv. Hi, Liv. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you for having me. I'm good. I'm really
taking time to join us tonight. I know you're like super busy, and yeah, I know this is a big deal for you to be doing this, so I do appreciate it. And but I think that this is a really important conversation because, as I mentioned in the caption for this video, recovery is not a one size fits all, and it's not cookie cutter, and everybody has a different experience. And I think that, we gotta get real. Like, there's way too many people dying. There's way too much going on for us to get stuck, on just one way, and that has to be the only way. And we know that there are people who have, gone to AA and it hasn't, or NA, and to other 12-step fellowships. And, for some reason, they haven't found recovery there. And and they've had to try different things. And most of the time, not all the time, but we're made to feel like there's something wrong with us, or like there's a willingness issue if AA doesn't work for us. And that's a mistake. And I don't want anyone, if anybody has had a negative experience with a 12-step fellowship, I don't want them to feel like there's no hope for them. I don't want them to feel that recovery is not possible. Like, I think it's our responsibility to let people know that there are other ways to recover. There's not just one pathways. And I think as a recovery community, we need to support anyone and everyone who's making their way on over to sobriety, to recover, however they get there. Because I think at this point in the crisis is about saving lives. It's no longer about anything else, or the best way, or how did you get, it's about harm reduction and saving lives. So, that was somewhat of a long intro, and I just want to say really quickly hello to everybody who joined. Hi, Rebecca. Hi, Sarah. I have Tori in the comments, so she's going to be interacting with everybody in the comments. And we are also going to drop a link to the article that you wrote about this topic. But Liv, why don't you tell the community a little bit more about you and your background, and how did you even start writing about recovery, and how did this become your profession? Like, most people don't know you can make a living from writing about your own experiences. So that's pretty cool.
It's amazing. I had no idea that I could do that. I started my recovery, as you can tell from my accent. I am American, but I grew up in England, and where I lived in the northwest of England, the only recovery was 12 steps. So that's what I did. And I did that for the first few years. But around the 2-year mark, I was in this shitty job, and I was thinking, I'm spending my life in the shitty job and in my evenings in church basements. But is this really what recovery is about? And, and then I would just dig a little deeper, and I'd be told that, I've got to ignore those instincts, and that's just my disease talking. And, or there's someone in the car park, your disease is in the car park doing push-ups waiting for you to, and, and I believed it. And I honestly, at that point in my life, I didn't really have an identity. I didn't have enough self-esteem or a sense of self to be able to make those decisions or to trust my instincts. So I started a blog, and Liv's Recovery Kitchen. And initially it was about my journey because what was happening is I was going to these meetings in my shitty job, and I would be eating all the food on the way home. And I didn't understand what was happening. So I have a very curious brain and tried to figure it out. And then I just started a blog talking about that journey. And I started working with a coach, and she started to ask me how I could make my life bigger than food and just recovery. And as part of that, I started interviewing people in America. And then it was like my world exploded. I was like, oh my God, people recover in all of these different ways, and there's nothing wrong with them. What I'm being told is not true. It's not true that when people leave that they die, and all of these other myths. And it was only when I moved to America that I just thought, I can't do this anymore, and I left. But writing, it's funny, when I moved here, I just began writing full time. People had read my blogs and said, I love your writing, we'll pay you to write for us. And I was blown away by that. I still am today. When people read my articles and they send me something, I don't get a lot of feedback. And they just, although I don't read the comments on articles like this, I have to say. And they were popular. And so last year I wrote 300 articles on recovery.
Wow, 300 articles? Oh my gosh. So you know what you're talking about when it comes to this topic. And to be clear, we're not here to bash AA or to bash anything, but it's something that happens to people. And as you guys have been tuning in for a while, we don't shy away from controversial topics or topics, like harm reduction and just topics that we need to discuss. If we don't discuss them as the recovery community, who's going to discuss them? Who's going to come in and host these conversations for us, right? No one. So again, there are people out there struggling because they can't find their way. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to, not have a conversation if there's somebody struggling because somebody's going to get offended. We have to be able to have conversations and face facts that, certain things don't work for everyone. So by no means is this about bashing anything or anyone or what works for anyone. We all need to stick to what works for each of us. But again, we need to provide options, or at least provide, hope for people who don't find that hope in the places that they've turned to already. What else is out there? So just wanted to put that, make that clear, that that's not what this is about. This is about, what do we do if that doesn't work? Are we out of options? Do we just give up? Do we go back to using? Certainly nobody wishes that on anyone. So that's what we're here to discuss. So let's dive right into it. You sort of already touched on this, but why did you choose to sort of, aside from your personal experience, did you also feel like a lot of other people were having the same experience, and that's why you chose to write about this and to sort of dive deeper and look at the research and look at the studies and sort of what motivated you to go after this topic?
Well, people kept coming to me. I have a really strong value of justice. And, if I feel like there's any injustice or someone is being treated unfairly, for example, whilst I completely agree with you that I am not here to bash AA, I am here to say that if it doesn't work for them, it doesn't mean that they're incapable of being honest.
Right.
And, when people come into recovery, they are so full of shame that the worst thing we could possibly do is shame them even more. So if something doesn't work, it means it doesn't work. It doesn't mean that we're rejecting your pathway of recovery or we're threatening you in any way. I just feel like we have a responsibility as people in recovery, as sponsors even. I overheard this conversation with a close family member who took a call about, it was a 12-step call, and the person on the call said, well, what other options are out there? And the person that took the call couldn't answer. And it occurred to me, I thought about that quite a lot, and it occurred to me, like, why are we not educating ourselves? I think, maybe even part of the 12th step is to educate ourselves about ways in which we can be of service to people. And sometimes that might mean knowing about other pathways of recovery, and actually knowing what the studies say, and the studies, it doesn't say that 100% of people recover in 12-step fellowships. That's not accurate. In fact, just under half of the people that recover do so without any intervention. We don't hear about that.
Yeah.
But of the people that do have assisted pathway use, mutual aid groups like AA, like Refuge Recovery, like LifeRing, they make up a portion of that, and they've all been shown to be just as successful as AA. So, if someone finds the word God offensive or doesn't want to find a higher power, they could go to LifeRing, or they could go to Smart Recovery. For me, it's become about how we can reduce harm. And I think we should be looking at all recovery through a lens of harm reduction, rather than harm reduction being an option of recovery. I was speaking to Devon Reeves the other day, and he said, I know you had him on recently, and he said that people are 5 times more likely to enter treatment going through a harm reduction program. Like, why don't we talk about that? Instead of saying, people shouldn't use safe injection sites, or we shouldn't be providing clean needles, and and encouraging people to use. Actually, what we need to do is to treat people like human beings that are suffering.
Yes.
And being on the other side of that and having found recovery, like, the least I could do is to give someone a hand and say, how can I help you?
Absolutely, 100% agree with everything you've mentioned. And, it's funny you say, like, when, when you talk about your experience at looking at the United States and kind of, what was happening here, and there were other ways to find recovery. But I remember for me, as, living in the United States, when I started becoming part of social media recovery communities, I learned that there were other people who were sober who did not participate in 12-step programs. And I was blown away, because I was taught that was the only way. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's possible. And, for me, like, that worked for a time. I no longer attend meetings, but that's, what works for me doesn't, may not work for anybody else. I don't push my recovery on any, that's totally different. But I think that it's very, even for somebody who lives in the United States, we may not even know that there are different alternatives to recovery other than 12 steps. And again, I think the biggest danger is thinking that if that doesn't work for you, that you're hopeless, and that your only option is to go back out, use, and God forbid OD or something happen to you. And I think that's really dangerous. And one of the things that I do not like about our community is that we're very quick to shame people if they're not doing the things that have worked for us. And, I've had an issue with that sort of thinking. And, that was a big issue for me. And I think, for example, when somebody relapses, I think some of the first people who judge are people that are in recovery or sort of like becomes this gossipy thing, like, oh my God, you hear that so-and-so relapsed, when in fact, we're the ones that need to be the most compassionate towards that condition because we're the most familiar with it. So how do we expect to like end the, like close up the empathy gap, you know, when it comes to like the regular public who thinks this is a moral failing? Like, how are we going to make any progress when our own community turns against us, when we relapse, you know, when we fail by whatever standards, you know, certain individuals have set? It's not even, you know, this isn't even like a national standard. These are individuals setting these sort of like unsaid rules. And it's like, how can we support the national, and you know, there's advocates out there right now that are working to end this stigma, but like, we got to clean up, you know, our mess inside the recovery community.
Absolutely.
And the shaming, you know, and the shaming of the relapsing, and the shaming when people don't do exactly what we tell them to do, but they wind up sober anyway. And I mean, I'm seeing some of the comments here, and, you know, I see like, you know, people saying like, you know, I did this and I'm still sober, and I did this and I'm still sober. So there's people actually on this very common thread saying, I found another way that it wasn't, you know, a 12-step fellowship. So this isn't, you know, something that we're making up. This is a real thing. And, you know, again, I think it's just so important to show newcomers and to show people who are still struggling that, you know, there's a lot of ways, and just try it and give it a shot because you're worth it, and there's hope. You know, I just never want somebody to feel like that's not, you know, that they don't have hope. Like, I don't think we're at that point in this crisis to be turning people away, or again, to shame people about,
no.
you know,
No, and I've heard things like, if AA doesn't work for you, you can't be a real alcoholic, or, you know, things like that. Internal stigma is huge, you know, and I've been writing about that for a long time. And I just feel like what we need to do is we need to keep having these conversations. We need to keep shining a light on what the reality of the situation is, which is it doesn't work for everybody. And there are lots of different other options out there. And we need to be compassionate, exactly like you say, you know. Returning to use is not an option. It doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to live, especially not if we want to live and we want to, you know. So why do you think, you know, 12-step fellowships don't work for some people? Like, what do you think happens? I mean, why didn't it work for you rather than, you know, let's experiences? For
me, I feel like I grew out of it. And, you know, and I see that a lot in other people too. I actually set up a group for people that are leaving or have left 12-step fellowships because I wanted them to know that their fears were valid. And I think that's a really important point. You know, all of these instincts that are screaming at us, like, this isn't working, I can't keep doing this, there has to be something else out there. And instead of thinking that they have a monster living in their head, you know, to actually provide a forum to say, actually, yeah, I experienced that too. You know, that I think that's really important. I mean, going back to the question, I think I grew out of it. I think along the continuum of recovery, your needs change. You know, initially, like I said, I didn't know who I was. I was numb. You know, when someone mentioned to me that about fear, I was like, oh, that's not an issue for me. I had no idea what was going on internally. And also I had no community. And I think the reason why AA is successful for some people, and for a lot of people that do leave later on, is that it's a ready-made community that's supportive, you know, that helps you, that you can speak to, you can attend meetings. And sometimes, you know, in the early days, meetings for me were just a quiet space. You know, I just feel like along the journey, I woke up to who I am, and I didn't need to identify with a philosophy that was fundamentally not who I am. You know, I think for me, a lot of the language is written at a time that doesn't relate to who women are today. It doesn't relate to the way that we use substances today. You know, we use drugs today, and you know, a lot of people in AA don't accept people that take substances, you know, because they see the two disorders, alcohol use disorder and substance use disorder, as completely different things. Whereas I don't, you know, I I think maybe it was more simple back then, you know. I don't know. I think for me, and this is a really important point actually, that 12-step programs don't address trauma, and nor do they say that they do. But you know, given that Gabor Mate says, you know, the leading physician in addiction says, well, one of that, you know, nearly 90% of people that suffer with addiction have had a basis in trauma. You know, if we're not healing that, then it's going to come out in other ways, whether that's returning to use, whether that's, you know, developing an addiction to something else. All the behaviors are the same. It's just whichever substance, person, or whatever we choose to use, you know. So for me, you know, and what's interesting is I didn't know this until I moved to America. I have complex PTSD. You know, I was 5 years in recovery, and I had no idea that my normal was actually highly abnormal, that my body was so dysregulated all the time. That was my new normal. And it was only in moving to America and actually getting some intensive therapy that I was like, oh my God, my world just changed. You know, life became colorful again. And I started to deal with the root of the issue for me. So yeah, it didn't work because it didn't address all of the things that I needed. But in the early days, that's what I need. I needed a recovery community. And I say to my therapist all the time, I have a bit of a resentment that, and I'm quite honest about this, that, you know, I feel like someone should have pointed it out. You know, why are people in 12-step fellowships not trauma informed? And actually, an interesting person to talk to about this might be Dr. Jamie Marrick. She's written a book on trauma and the 12 steps to help people become more trauma informed, so that they can point out, you know, actually there might be some other things that you might need to look at here. And even though literature says sometimes there are outside issues. So But my therapist always says to me, Liv, you know, you wouldn't have been able to deal with this trauma you know, less than a year sober. You got to the point when you got to the point.
Yeah. No, and I think, you know, I love that you said that, because I think for me too, at the beginning, I needed that framework. I needed the community. I needed the support. I needed, you know, exactly that framework. But, you know, after a while, and I think we all discover this, the more time that you get, is that there are other, you know, mental health symptoms that we're going to experience as we move through recovery. Most of the time, you know, our using was, you know, us medicating something, and, you know, and aside from whatever, you know, biological reasons or predisposition we had to the disease of addiction, you know, there's other stuff going on. And, you know, we still don't know what came first, the chicken or the egg, you know, that addiction come first, or the mental health you know, depression or anxiety. Like, we don't know, and researchers still don't know that. But, you know, I think there is, you know, something to be said about, you know, once we have enough time and we feel stable enough in our recovery to start peeling off some of the layers and to start working, you know, with a specialist, you know, a therapist who specializes in trauma or anxiety or whatever, you know, is coming up for you. But I think you're absolutely right. I think we are at the point where even, you know, within you know, 12-step circles, like, we do need to be more informed. And as sponsors, have the responsibility to say, you know what, I'm only here to sponsor you through this. And, you know, this kind of stuff, like, you should go see a therapist, or you should go receive care. Because for any other disease, we would not say, like, oh, okay, well, just, you know, you have pancreatic, you know, issues. Let's just, like, parade them away. No, you'd refer that individual to a doctor, and you'd have them, seek treatment or go see a doctor, get an opinion. And, I can only help you through this. And so I think that we do have that responsibility, as people who are guiding newcomers, in the door, and want them to stay and not struggle or keep going back out. And, there's a lot of reasons why people don't stay. And we'll get into that a little bit. But, I think you're absolutely right. I think after we're stable enough and we're prepared to start looking at some of the other mental health symptoms we're having, we need to, because otherwise it's just going to be a Band-Aid on the bigger issue.
And there is some science around, you were saying about the chicken and the egg, the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, which was conducted, I think, in the 80s. It was this huge study that examined adverse experiences in people's childhood, and they came up with some really profound science that showed that based on this 10-question questionnaire, like, I don't know, for example, have you experienced neglect or abuse, or the divorce, or were you abandoned in any way, or all of those different types of awful childhood experiences, they could say that each yes in those questions equated to a 10% increased risk of chronic illness in later life, even to the point where they could say, if this man has this score, he's highly likely to become an IV heroin user by the age of. It's really quite fascinating, and there's an incredible book called Childhood Disrupted. Even Gabor Mate talks about this in The Body Says No, because what happens is if you don't deal with these issues and you stick around, in whatever type of recovery you have, it's going to come out sideways. So for me, it came out in my body. But autoimmune conditions, there's, cancers, addiction, you name it. It's really quite fascinating.
It is. It really is. And all the ways that, we can experience like all these other things we've been through, and how they start to, surface once we've had some time, and once we've, gotten rid of substances and have been, working whatever program we're a part of. Then we get, that clarity to say, okay, there's something else going on here. This isn't right, or this isn't normal. And for those of you tuning in, again, this isn't to bash AA. This isn't, we believe that whatever works for anyone is great. We just want you to be on the side of recovery and to know that there's hope. And, we don't want the people, again, who have not found a place to feel like there's no hope for them. So again, just if you're just tuning in, this isn't, some sort of AA bashing session or anything like that. It is having a conversation about what happens if it doesn't work for you. What do you do? Yeah. What are the alternatives? So that's a great segue to my next question for you, Liv. What if AA doesn't work for someone? What can they do?
There are so many different pathways to recovery. So I've written about this in a number of my articles, which we can put links up, and they have a list of, I spent a long time of other meetings, and I spent a long time thinking about the elements of 12-step fellowships that I loved. So I needed connection and community, but what I needed more than anything was empathy. I needed someone to say, me too, I get it. So I looked at that. I looked at the need to process, what is going on for me on a weekly basis. I liked that aspect of having a sponsor relationship, but what I really needed was a therapist, someone that was professionally trained that could say, this is what you're experiencing. What do you think of the solution? And we could really work through and process what's going on for me. I call it physical therapy for my head. And and meditation was also really important. So I looked at those elements, and I would encourage anybody else to look at any elements that were positive, as well as what doesn't work for them, because it's got to be a balance. And then from that place, you can explore other options. But I think the most important thing to get across is to not feel shame, to not feel like there's something wrong with you, to not
Yes.
feel like something really bad is going to happen to you, because that's what you've been conditioned to believe. And I think that is fundamentally wrong. You know, like we've both said, you know, if AA works for you, absolutely, I champion that. You know, I support you, I've got your back. But please don't shame anyone that
Yeah.
work for, and don't tell them that they're going to die, because that's not true. You know, that I know many hundreds of people that have left and are doing really well, because what happens is, I feel like there's this shift. People start to trust themselves again. I feel like when you're still in 12-step fellowships, you're handing over this power all the time. Right. And when you leave, it's really, you become so unsteady. You're like, oh my God, I don't know whether to believe what my instincts are telling me. Yeah. Right, exactly. So you actually, yeah, you start to regain agency, and it's a really empowering process. So at that point, you can try lots of different options. You know, you don't have to latch onto something like your life depends on it. There are so many things out there that you can try. What I did is I went to refuge recovery because I had heard great things about it, and I went to a meeting because I'm fortunate to live in Portland in Oregon, and I loved it. It didn't turn out to be the right option for me, but I then explored different avenues from there. I realized, well, I really love the meditation, so why don't I find a meditation community here? And I really like these individual people, so why didn't I strike up friendships with them? And then I found therapy and naturopathic care, and I realized that what I needed to build was a holistic approach to recovery. You know, a therapy, you know, it is privileged to say that I have access to therapy. Not everybody does. So, you know, there are options to find someone through insurance plans, or, you know, to find a mentor. You can find mentors in refuge recovery groups. They have a similar system to a sponsorship. There's always going to be a community of people that you can speak to, and you can process what's going on for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's refuge recovery, there's smart recovery, there is, you know, just so many different other options for people who can't afford therapy. You know, therapy is completely different than from what these organizations offer. I still think, you know, there's a separation. Your sponsor is not your therapist. You know, I think therapists go through a lot of training. They, you know, they go through exams and, you know, have to follow ethics, guidelines and a lot of other things. But, you know, there's definitely a lot of resources. I know we wrote an article with a whole entire list of resources. Tori, I know you're probably watching and listening. So if you have that article handy, if you could just go ahead and post it in the comments, just so people have the list of the other options that are available, just in case.
I have some on my website too, and I've included other things like white bison or wellbriety, because I think there are certain cultural mutual aid groups that we don't necessarily consider. So there's actually a recovery organization for Jewish people, for Muslims, for Native Americans. There's so many different options out there if a mutual aid group is what you want. So yeah, it's just explore, get curious. You know, you don't have to be rigid about it, because you're not going to die. You know, that's the
and I mean, you know, that is just like such a, you know, touchy subject, because there's some people who are so at risk that if they don't do something, they, you know, we don't know if they'll make it back. But I think using that as a fear tactic or as a way to, you know, manipulate someone into doing whatever, you know, or not manipulate, but kind of like force your own beliefs on someone else, like that's not cool, you know. So definitely use
it's
that.
kind of generational, you know, like people talk about, and this really makes me cringe, but people talk about 12-step fellowship in a lineage kind of way, like my sponsor and da 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 da, you know, and they have certain beliefs and that kind of feeds through. Sometimes when people say, you know, this is the only way, or any kind of dogmatic conditioning, it's because that's what they've been told and they don't necessarily question it. And
Right.
when you leave, you start to question, oh, that doesn't make sense anymore, or what does make sense for me? And that's when you just start to, I think it's a really interesting process.
Yeah, absolutely. When we start to sort of grow and sort of find ourselves, because like you say, when we first get in, we sort of hand over, you know, our own agency and say, you know, I can't think, I can't make decisions for myself because look at where where this got me. So help me. And, you know, there's a place for that. You know, I think there is a place for that sort of surrender, you know, within that early recovery phase where you're just like, you need help and you need somebody to guide you, and there's a time and place for that. But after a while, you know, the longer you've been in recovery, you start to experience that discovery of like, yeah, you know, I'm learning these things about myself clean and sober. I'm experiencing different symptoms that I'm not quite sure, you know, what they are. So that is, you know, a very interesting process that we go through and that we're still learning about, because when you think about it, like the research is new, like all this recovery science and the recovery research is still pretty like new field compared to other diseases. So, you know, there's still such a long way to go. So here's my question. So there are times there are people that are just unwilling to surrender to some degree, right? So how do you know the difference between your disease talking or if in fact this isn't working for you? Because sometimes, you know, your disease will come out and say like, this meeting sucks, or like this therapy session sucks, or like this isn't, you know, gonna help me. And, you know, so how do you know when in fact it's time to look for other options and it's not your disease talking?
I think that's a really interesting question. And I would preface this with saying I don't believe in having that separate personality. Like, I don't believe in there being a disease that has a personality in my brain, because to me that it kind of creates a split where I feel like I have a monster living within me, you know, and I've got to be constantly wary of that. Whereas I have a more mindful approach of like, well, you know, if therapy is boring, you know, or if this meeting is boring, then something's not working. You know, why isn't it working? Well, am I in a meeting where people just complain about their broken washing machines? Well, that's happened quite a lot, you know. Maybe I need to try a different meeting. If I'm feeling like over the course of 3, 6, 9 months that having tried different meetings and that's still not working for me and just getting increasingly frustrated and fed up, maybe I need to try a different meeting. Maybe I need to go and see a therapist. Maybe I need to try different options. I believe that the body has an incredible wisdom, and when we give it a personality in that way, we're ignoring that wisdom. And yes, you could argue that, you know, well, your disease got you in the state that it did, and absolutely it did. But what was happening in your brain is that when you put a drug in it, it was overriding your sense of logic and rationale. So, you know, when you stop doing that, you are able to see all of these things going in your body. So you just need to go through a process of, and I say it like you just need to, it's incredibly difficult to sit back and say, okay, well, I'm really craving carbs. Like for the first 2 years, I couldn't stop eating bagels, cakes, cream cakes, cheese, like anything. And then when I looked at it and tried to understand what was going on in my body, my brain chemistry was all messed up. So what I really needed to do was to get some medical support and medication was right for me, plus doing other things to naturally improve my mood, like exercise, like retraining my appetite to get the same sensation and sense of joy out of healthier food. And yeah, so I think that we can have a more mindful approach of what these thoughts and these actions are telling us.
So I love that, and I agree with that. But the place where I come into conflict with that, because, right, like if we think of addiction as a medical disease, it technically doesn't have a voice of its own that makes you do things, right? Like this is your brain sort of saying, I need this chemical, I'm craving this, I need this to survive, right? So it technically doesn't have a voice. But there's something to be said about the denial aspect of this disease that sort of
surrender,
almost makes you think or makes you believe that you are not sick, you know? So like I want to think, like you said, that there isn't this separate thing, this autonomy thing, but then what in the world is this thing that makes us, like, it's the only disease I'm aware of that, and you know, this is probably a slogan and it's where I've heard it, but like, you know, it's the only disease that convinces you it doesn't exist. Right? Like it's the only disease that we know. Like when you're going through like any other disease, you don't have that denial that we experience when we, you know, experience an active addiction. And
sometimes we do. So, you know, like some guys, for example, that, you know, experience certain symptoms of prostate cancer or colorectal cancer, like they ignore going to the doctors. You know, and that's why a lot of the times, you know, things are discovered at later stages because they're in denial. They're like, I don't want to face that right now.
Yeah.
So in the same way as addiction, I mean, I'm not a neuroscientist. I wish I was. But I would love to study brains all day. But I think that it's similar. Like it's sometimes the pain or the anticipated pain of facing the reality of what we're doing is too much. And it's only once that seesaw tips and we actually think, well, the pain of not doing anything is greater when we actually take action. So I think denial exists in a lot of cases. You know, and I surrender, I don't really like that word, but acceptance, same thing, right? You know, ultimately is saying, I have a problem, I need to get some help. I think that's the first step, right?
Absolutely. This has been an amazing conversation.
I could talk to you all day.
I mean, we could talk all day. That would be, you know, we're friends, so we could, you know, totally have this conversation and go back and forth. And this is what it's about, having you know, and I love Tim for this, who's the creator of Sober Nation, that sort of lets us, you know, just do our thing and create this space for us to have these kind of conversations. And, you know, we can write articles all day long, but there's something to be said about having live conversations and interacting real time. And that's why I love doing these lives. So where can people go to learn more about you?
They can go to livesrecoverykitchen.com. I try to post links to my most popular articles. I'm fortunate to work with lots of publications that allow me to post them on my website. But yeah, you can find me on The Fix. You can find me in Ravishly, loads of different places. And I also do a lot of consulting work with people too. So I'm helping write various organizations content in Oregon, actually. But it's nationwide. So yeah.
Yeah, no, you do amazing work, and I'm so grateful, you know, to have you as somebody that I know, but I think you're such an asset to, you know, our field, and your voice is so important. And I just thank you for speaking up and sharing your experience and like what, you know, some of the conversations and the topics that you're bringing up that are not easy. And I'm sure, like you said, you don't read the comments on some of these articles because, you know, people are not very nice sometimes, but I know that takes guts, and you're a real person who has feelings. So I appreciate you speaking up about things that may not get positive comments. But I mean, if we don't have these conversations, somebody, can be affected by it. So thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
No, I so appreciate it. And for those of you who watch real time, thank you so much for your comments. Thank you for keeping the conversation constructive, and for engaging with us. If you're watching the replay, be sure to leave a comment, join the conversation. We're always jumping in here and still keeping the conversation going after the live video is over. So again, be sure to visit the links that Tori just dropped. And check out Liv and some of her other work and her other articles. And there she has like resources and other places that you can go ahead and learn about, other pathways to recover if that's what you're looking for. So thank you again, everybody, for watching. We will see you guys next week. Thank you, Liv. Good night.